Excited today to be joined by Sumant Ramachandra from Baxter for our opening keynote today, and let's get started. So you recently published an article on why technology alone can't save healthcare. So I was interested to hear why you believe that, and what did you mean by that?
Yeah, so the article was published on LinkedIn, and a lot of it is due to personal experience, and it was just reinforced this weekend. So I'll tell you a little story. So each one of us has an individual mindset and individual behavior, and that's a good thing. So therefore, by the fact that we're human, we don't all operate exactly the same way. And that subtle nuance of how we interact with each other, how we respond when we're sick, or how we respond when we're healthy to things that we're trying to do is going to be different. So technology is a great basis to actually equalize healthcare, but the care of the patient is fundamentally a human endeavor. And that interaction between the healthcare providers, the patient, and what we as companies do to ensure that the patient gets the best care possible is critical. So technology is great to get that access, but still the care of the patient is actually an individual endeavor and human endeavor. So how was that reinforced this weekend? So on Wednesday night, I got a call. My father, who was admitted to the hospital about a week before that, turned critically ill. And I had to fly down to Florida to go see him. So on Thursday morning, I headed down there. And the first thing I saw is they were treating him per the algorithms of the hospital. Not that the algorithms are wrong, but it didn't take into fact that he has diabetes, he has huge amount of steroids going in him, multiple antibiotics, and he was in respiratory distress. So I'm a physician by training, and you start noticing that he's not responding to therapy per their protocol. And their next step is to get even more aggressive. Do a bronchial lavage, intubate him, and I had to put a stop to it. And I said, this is a healthy man. He's not responding per your protocols this way. I asked to see all the lab data. We sat down as a healthcare team, brought the pulmonologist, the infectious disease specialist, the hospitalist, and the internist all into one conversation. They were all coming at different times. But that's how our healthcare system runs in America, all at different times. So there's a care team, but where's the team? So we sat down and had a conversation saying, these are the best antibiotics to give him. This is probably what you want to do. Don't do the bronchoalveolar lavage. He was getting insulin dosing from an algorithm, from a company, and it was calculating high doses of insulin. Now, my father knows this insulin. He's a very well-controlled diabetic. He walked into the hospital critically ill with a hemoglobin A1C of 7.1, and he's been a 35-year diabetic. So this guy has good control. And he and I are saying, this thing is spitting out the wrong insulin dose. It can get him hypoglycemic. A little bit of hyperglycemia once in a while doesn't kill a patient, but hypoglycemia does. So you had to intervene even further and make sure they weren't giving. But the nurse said, well, that's what this algorithm's telling me to give. And I said, what do you think should be given? If 1 unit of insulin reduces your glucose levels to 50 milligrams per deciliter. Let's calculate it together. And you start realizing that technology is a good basis, but it can't be the end-all to how patients are treated.
So how do you integrate that concept into product development?
It's interesting. We used to have a field called human factors. Now it's called user experience. And one of the reasons I think people start changing the terminology is human factors is a lot about testing the requirements at the end of development. User experience to say, what should be the user's experience? Healthcare is given in a variety of settings. It's going back home with you. where you're not going to be a healthcare provider. You're going to be a patient, a caregiver. So what is the experience that the user needs to feel? And how do we integrate that early on into our requirements so that whether it's a nurse, a physician, a therapist giving it in a hospital acute setting, or an intermediate care setting like rehab, or at the home, we understand that user experience, so we bake it in early. We bake it into requirements. We understand the potential settings where things are used. And on top of that, in today's world, because our devices are connected, we actually have to understand what are all the bad things that can happen because they're connected. And how do we bake that in early? And how do we stay alert? Because with cybersecurity, anything else can happen no matter what your good intent was.
So medical device companies have a number of different stakeholders that they need to sort of address or deal with. Mm-hmm. How does Baxter approach all of the varied stakeholders in the medical device space?
So first and foremost is you have to figure out what is the unmet need you're trying to solve for. And if your unmet need takes you to a definition space where you actually understand who are the potential users of your product, and I don't break down the world in terms of, from a development perspective and a regulatory perspective, we break down the world in terms of medical devices and pharmaceuticals. But if any of you have been patients, do you actually care whether it's a medical device or a pharmaceutical? You care what therapy you get. You care how people treat you during that therapy. That's what you care about. So if you break it down to during that therapy, what other products may be given, who is going to interact with your product versus others, and how is the patient influencing either choice or usability. So I always say you start with the patient. If the patient is impacting how a product is used, you've got to figure that variable out because it's the most human variable. The chances that a patient knows exactly what to do is going to be very, very low unless they're very good and have done it like my father, who was, as an engineer, he has figured out the math behind his diabetes. Okay? Better than many doctors can. And I'm a physician, but I can say that as an engineer, he has done this. But most patients are not like him. So you have to figure that piece out. The next key stakeholder is the healthcare provider. Most of products are interfaced not by physicians always, but by nurses, by pharmacists, by respiratory therapists, by physical therapists. Who is going to actually work with the device? What information do they need to make the right decision for the patient? So those are the first most important key stakeholders. You also have to think about the regulator, because in the end of the day, most ministries of health have an important obligation to society and public health. They share our goal to take care of the patient, but they have to protect the patient first. And everything they do is around that premise. They understand what benefit risk is. They love transparency from companies. So engaging early to understand how they may think about this and assess it and adjudicate it becomes critically important. So you don't have an adversarial relationship during a process. The last but not least is actually the payer. In today's world, we think that if we build it, they will come. But there are so many products out there. Consumer tech has gone through the roof from utilization in healthcare. But most of these things are being paid out of pocket. They're not covered, most of them, by payers. So if you want to be covered by a payer, you have to think about that early. And you have to think about what is the evidence needed for each of these 4 key stakeholders to ensure that your product is built for success commercially. So how we do it, Baxter has evolved as a company in the last few years. If you follow the Baxter story, it's actually a turnaround story. This part of Baxter was heavily underinvested. So when we spun out Baxalta, we were left with a vitality index of less than 1%. Our peer group was sitting between 15 to 25%. We had a net profit that was so low, investors would ask, why invest here versus there? So our CEO, Joe Almeida, came in and changed a lot of who this company was. And he brought a management team that also changed it. Part of that change is that we brought in a design process called the Stanford Biodesign process. We adopted something that focused on the unmet need and what problem you're trying to solve and how to do it. Because we needed some basis to restart the engine. Now we have adopted that and we have changed it to more of a Baxter biodesign so that integrates into what we try to do, because the Stanford biodesign process is a lot for startups, single person companies, virtual companies. It kind of hits a lot of gaps. But there are pieces of it that fit really nicely into Baxter, particularly in the front end in exploratory development, when you're trying to define the unmet need and what specific problem you're trying to solve for that can create value for the healthcare system, and that where you can also extract value in a more profitable manner. So those things are not delinked, they're actually linked. So when you actually raise the profitability of a company, you actually have the opportunity then to reinvest into your healthcare system to do future projects. And that is what the journey Baxter has been going through recently.
So turning to current events, where do you start? The administration recently put out a big initiative on renal care, renal health, and Baxter was pretty quick to say that they were going to get behind that. I think you're putting something like $500 million towards developing programs along that line. How does something like that impact you on the day-to-day, and how did you go about turning that around so quickly?
Yeah, so our biggest business is renal care. We are the #1 peritoneal dialysis company in the world. And we also have presence in hemodialysis. So the care of patients at end-stage renal disease becomes very important to us as a company. Now, we have expanded our remit to say that how do we go upstream? Because end-stage renal disease is literally stage 5 of chronic kidney disease. That means there were 4 stages before stage 5. So you need to intervene earlier. If you're going to do the right thing as a company, you got to intervene earlier to see how you can impact the patient in a positive manner. So we look at things like kidney transplantation to understand what the trends are. We look at things like diabetes management and how it impacts chronic kidney disease, hypertension management, and how it impacts chronic kidney disease as it moves towards end-stage renal disease where patients become dialysis dependent. So we had been interacting with many key stakeholders across the spectrum, physicians, patient groups, governments, on this front for years. And so when our president signed the executive order, we were well prepared because we strongly believe that if we can increase the therapeutic options for patients, and the executive order from the president focused on 2 fronts. One was to increase in the United States the number of kidney transplants available, because the wait list is pretty long. Now, in many countries, they don't actually have a long wait list for kidney transplantation. Why? Most of us are born with 2 healthy kidneys. Now, most of us are more than willing to sometimes give that 1 healthy kidney to family members. Culturally, we feel much closer for that versus a perfect stranger. But in many other countries, it is donated to a stranger. And unfortunately, in some countries, it's sold to a stranger. So there are always bad parts to this. But the good part is we have 2 healthy kidneys. And if we have the opportunity to give one of our kidneys to someone in need, would we do it? So that's a key part of this executive order, to increase the number of kidney transplants from not just cadaveric transplants, but also from living donors. And how does that work? So suppose I give up 1 kidney and then I get end-stage renal disease, I'm a pre-diabetic, will I be on the top of the list for a future kidney? Okay. So those are the kind of policy things that have to work out. Now that's a pretty high hurdle because culturally, as Americans, we have not gotten over the hurdle of donating our kidneys as a living donor just to a perfect stranger. Okay, so it's a high hurdle. It's a big ask. The second piece of the executive order is, how do you take end-stage renal disease dialysis care home? Now, in-center dialysis is a good thing, but if you can give people options at home and you can train them to take care of their overall disease state, because remember, someone who has end-stage kidney disease has a lot of other medical issues. They don't just have end-stage kidney disease. They got end-stage kidney disease because they were diabetic, they had hypertension, or some other disease. So they likely live with other comorbidities. And as a result of that, how do you get the patient to think about their end-stage renal disease and their comorbidities at home, where frankly, it's one of the best places for treatment? Less infections, less complications due to disparate healthcare teams. Patient takes, or caregiver takes at home and empowers how to care for themselves. These concepts do need not just an executive order. They need fundamental changes in reimbursement. They need fundamental changes in how we support patients at home. And Baxter as a company has been in the home care in peritoneal dialysis for many, many decades. So for us, it was a natural fit to think about it. Now, we are also in the HD space in hemodialysis. We don't run centers in the United States. We do run them in many other countries. But we do deliver peritoneal dialysis solutions and automated peritoneal dialysis cyclers to patients' homes every day. You'll see a Baxter truck once in a while on the interstates. That's what they're carrying, a lot of the medicines to people's homes as well as to hospitals. So for us, it was very natural to say, this is a good thing for patients in the healthcare system, and we as a company can help serve that. So our CEO made a commitment with the HHS secretary in Bloomington, Indiana, to invest close to $500 million to help improve the delivery and capacity around home care in dialysis. And that's a pretty big commitment for any company. And it's a pretty big commitment for Baxter, but it's actually a core part of our business. It's one of our 6 businesses. And that's critically important for us to continue being leaders, but also being publicly saying what we need to do to take care of those patients.
So if one of the focuses is on earlier intervention, a lot of that is sort of behavioral change, which is probably the hardest intervention to successfully execute.
Yeah.
How do you go about doing that and encouraging people to actually change their behavior before they get to that critical end stage?
Yeah, we spoke about it right before we came on stage, that there are a lot of great companies out there that are working on behavioral modification. And I opened it by this statement that we are all individuals, and that's a good thing, by us being individuals. And therefore, what reinforces my neural pathways to change my behavior will be different than someone else's. So how do we use technology today to help reinforce good behaviors? So last year in April, I was about 35 pounds heavier. My hemoglobin A1C came back and I was a pre-diabetic. My father's a diabetic, I mentioned that. I had to change something in me. Others, I would go down that same path. And what I did is probably going to be different than what other people did. So when I make up my mind, I get disciplined. So I'm an intermittent faster now. I use an app to help me think about planning my day. I ate dinner yesterday, so I don't eat breakfast this morning. And I do things like that to modify my behavior. And for each patient, there is some unique formula that works. The question is, what tools can we give them that makes their life easier? Am I hungry this morning? Absolutely. My 3rd cup of coffee. Okay. To get me energized, to keep my metabolism going, and to keep me going through about the early afternoon. But that's a choice I make. Do I want my hemoglobin A1C to get to a level where I become insulin dependent? Or do I shed that 35 pounds, still have a little bit more to go after that, to get to a healthier state so that I am not dependent on a drug? So behavioral modification is individualized to how the patient thinks about what behaviors they need to be able to change. And then we as a healthcare team have to figure out what tools we give them to make life easier.
So can you tell us a little bit about other trends that are shaping Baxter's business?
Absolutely.
Stuff you have in the pipeline?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up, I was born in Europe, but I grew up in Nigeria and India and the United States, rural parts of the United States, a lot of my life. And healthcare delivery in many parts of the world, including most of America, is frankly not the same as many of the cities we live in. So one of the things as a healthcare industry we have to figure out is how to democratize the delivery of healthcare in a way that makes it actionable in many parts of the world. So one of the interesting conversations I had was many, many years ago. I read an article in the Wall Street Journal, and it talked about this hospital that was getting better cardiac outcomes than the Cleveland Clinic. And this hospital happened to be in Bangalore, India. Now, my parents are from Bangalore, India. So I'm thinking, I'm there for business. We had a partnership there. Visiting family. I'm going to visit this hospital. So I go to this hospital, and they think actually I'm JACO. I'm actually the Joint Commission coming in for an inspection. Okay, come with a tie and everything else. So they treat me really well at the lobby. They put me in a private room, and then they realize I'm the guy who asked for a visit to actually tour their outcomes, but I wasn't JACO. They were still very nice to me. They took me on a tour. So in the post-op cardiac care room, there are a number of patients. They're not private rooms. They're post-op, and there's curtains. I saw the absence of infusion devices. And I said, generally, this is a high acuity center. I was working at that time in a company that does infusion devices, and our company does infusion devices, Baxter. So I said, you don't use pumps here? I said, we do, once in a while. But it so happens that gravity still works. I'll pause for a moment if you didn't get that. If you can control the drip rate enough for the patient, and they're not on some highly potent vasopressor, gravity still works. So their scarce resource, which is an infusion pump, is used when gravity is not reliable enough. So you have to think about healthcare very differently in different parts of the world. But to do that, you have to have your engineers, your commercial folks, your scientists, your medical doctors, your nurses, your pharmacists understand those markets. And it's not the same. And healthcare is not democratized in most of the world. So one of the big trends for companies such as ourselves is to figure out the equation of what works in a local market. We know that Americans prefer automated peritoneal dialysis, but it's not easily adaptable in many parts of the world. So most of the world uses continuous ambulatory peritoneal dialysis, which is basically a bag with gravity and tubing delivering fluids into the peritoneal cavity and the effusion coming out. And then they change their bags. And the outcomes have been pretty good. Now, that's not a preferred modality in the US because we prefer to go to sleep, set up our APD machine, and then cycle through it. So during the day, we don't have anything hooked up. We just have a catheter coming out of our peritoneal cavity. And that's a societal choice of people. But both therapies work. So when you think about the delivery of therapy in emerging markets or in many parts of the United States, you have to think about it slightly differently. That a big city like Minneapolis or New York City, Boston, LA, San Francisco, Chicago have certain types of hospitals versus there may only be one hospital in a place in rural America that has a catchment area of 50 to 100 miles. How do you deliver that care in the most optimal manner? So one of the things that we have done in peritoneal dialysis is that our APD machine, our automated peritoneal dialysis machine, is connected to the EMR system in the nephrologist's office, that the nurse can check every day if a patient has actually gotten the peritoneal dialysis, and through some additional data input to see if it has been effective. It's called ShareSource. It's simple. It just connects the device to the EMR and gives sufficient information, not too much, sufficient for the nurse to say, the patient didn't get the full cycle. They're supposed to be cycling this way, but something changed. They can call the patient and say, hey, are you okay? Can you check your weight and tell me what it is? Because if not enough fluid has come out overnight, they're going to accumulate fluid. And therefore, you may have to adjust the cycle demand for the next night or ask them to take an extra session during the day. And that helps compliance. That helps outcomes. We have seen it reduce hospitalization dates. So it's quite incredible that a simple technological approach to a therapy can have an impact. And I bet you we at Baxter have only scratched the surface on this one. There's a lot more that can be done. And I think that's how you have to think about trends and how the intersection of technology and where society is going is important. The last trend I'd mention is that, I've reached the magical age where AARP wrote me a letter. You know what that age is. But there are many like me. There's many people who are aging in the United States, in many parts of the world. And in many parts of the world, the pyramid is inverted. The young population is small, and the elderly is massive. You have to think about healthcare delivery in an aging population. It's not all the same. And I think that's important because things that get impacted are vision, hearing, dextral ability, ambulation. Things that seem day-to-day normal, that I take for granted every single day, is not taken for granted for a patient who's aging. And if we want to serve an aging population better, we have to think about what they go through versus what most of us who do product development or commercialization who haven't hit that hurdle and barrier yet. So deeply understanding all the ancillary things happening with a patient or a healthcare provider is critically important.
Well, I think we have some time for some questions from the audience. Anyone have anything they'd like to ask Sumant? Don't go all at once.
Oh, so I got a long email yesterday, and thank you for asking. How's my father, he asked. That's very kind of you. So he is likely going to be discharged in the next couple of days. And my fear was if I didn't go down there and they did the bronchoalveolar lavage after intubating him, would he have made it out? Would they have seeded his lungs with Pseudomonas aeruginosa? And did he have adequate antibiotic coverage? I doubted myself when I started making these decisions because you never want to take over the care of a loved one when there's doctors and nurses all around. And I didn't sleep. But I believe I did the right thing. But thank you for asking.
No? Okay. Well,
Please.
We need to really move innovation forward in the system. What needs to happen?
Yeah. So I'll give you my perspective, and I'm sure all of you have perspectives. In healthcare, we should, of course, competition is a great thing. It drives innovation. But collaboration is a great thing. I will say that if you know of other groups or companies that are doing something better than you, partner. Get those technologies in. Advance your pipeline. Think about how you fit into the ecosystem. Because when we are product development companies, of course, we want our product to win. But fundamentally, we only want the patient to win. And the patient doesn't only see our product, they see an ecosystem around them. They see care around them. So how do we see it from the healthcare provider and patient's perspective? And what can we do to meet those needs. Sometimes it's a simple solution. I'll give you an example. So insulin is a high-risk drug. It's one of the top 5 medication errors that happens in the United States. And when it's mixed and compounded in a pharmacy and used in a hospital setting, insulin is given as units versus the typical compounding approach, which is milligrams. So imagine a pharmacist, all day long they're compounding. Sit in his or her shoes. They're under a hood. And if you ever see a compounding center, you're literally gowned up with gloves in a sterile hood, and you're compounding it right there. Because you have to keep it sterile. These are all injectable drugs. They're calculating a bunch of drugs using milligrams. And then suddenly they have to compound insulin using units. No matter how easy you think that is, there's a reason why we in America use miles and not kilometers. Because I can't still figure out, even though I grew up under kilometers, I have gone to miles all these years, and it's near like, okay, so 1.6, okay, 2.2 for the pounds to kilogram conversion, Fahrenheit to Celsius. It is like changing something. So as a result, what Baxter did was it identified years ago that it's a high-risk drug. Everyone said it's near impossible to make a product that's a mix, ready-to-use insulin in a bag. So we took that challenge on. It's hard, but we did it. We got approval from the FDA recently. And as a result, we believe that there are a number of bad outcomes. When you give an insulin drip in a hospital, remember what I said about hypoglycemia? If you do it wrong, a bad thing can happen. Well, now we're ready to launch a ready-to-use insulin in a bag. So the compounding goes away. And the healthcare system is seeing that value. So whenever you put yourself in the shoes of the healthcare provider or the patient, you have identified a real problem to solve. And real problems to solve are far more exciting than problems you think you have to solve. And those real problems are actually out there. And there's lots of them. But that's the beauty of healthcare, that it's a gift that just keeps giving, because when you hit the next summit, you look back, you celebrate your journey, and you say, wow, there's another summit up there. And you can do more and more. So innovation is understanding all of those areas where there's a convergence between what is the unmet need, the technologies exist, and the ecosystem will help support, deliver those technologies to that unmet need. So I think that is a mindset that the more we get into, we'll identify opportunities that are of economic value also. Because in the end of the day, when you solve a problem, you want to extract some economic value for your efforts so you can reinvest for the future. Okay? And that's what many of us do every day. Sometimes we strike out, it happens. And sometimes we have a home run. And that's a good thing. Hope that answers. Thank you.
I've got one if nobody else wants the mic. As somebody who leads a team of engineers, can you talk a little bit about what your approach is to mentoring young engineers to have this mindset of thinking of the patient and helping to identify unmet needs? I mean, what's the approach there for anyone else out there who runs a team of engineers?
Thank you for asking that. So I'm not a qualified engineer. My father, I started off in engineering school, but then I got interested in medical school, so I went off to medical school. My father's an engineer, and many of my colleagues are engineers, so I pretend to know I understand engineers. So forgive me if I say something wrong. But I had a wonderful dinner last night in Minneapolis with 5 engineers from our site here. And I had conversations ranging from how many children they have and what are their life, what they do for vacation, and we got into the topic of healthcare. The most important thing I think any of us can do, it doesn't matter you're an engineer or something else, is be curious. Be really curious. There's answers out there if you just ask all the right questions. The key thing is not to assume that the first answer you get is the right answer. And then read a lot. I spend a minimum of 2 hours learning anything I don't know. Whether it's a fictional book, a nonfiction, an article, I learn of fields that I just don't know. I learn things in material sciences and try to figure out how does that apply true to making a monitor or a cycler less noisy. Because nanomaterials appear to absorb certain noises. And these things sit at people's home by their bedside. And I send it off to my engineers. They probably think I'm all crazy. But I say, hey, can we reduce the noise by using this material if it gets cheap enough? And I learn a lot from people. So if the advice I would give, be curious, learn a lot, read a lot, and spend time with people who are smarter than you because they can always teach you. And if you're listening, if you're humble enough to listen with that curiosity, you will learn something. Most of the best ideas weren't born from one person's head. They were born from a conversation, sometimes over a beer, where someone says something, and someone says, wow, that's an interesting problem to solve. If you read the story of Uber, it came because a bunch of housemates in San Francisco were talking about how hard it is to get a cab ride. Okay, and then someone knew how to do something about it with a group of people. The same thing is you have to be able to listen and learn and then understand what is the problem you're trying to solve. I think that's a critical skill that sometimes we lose because we are listening to respond versus listening to understand. And you know the difference, right? How many of us, including myself, are listening to respond versus listening to understand the basis of the conversation, the basis of the question, and then what do we do about it? So that would be my advice. Thank you for asking.
Other questions for Sumant? We've got time for maybe one more. All right. How about a warm round of applause for Sumant?
Thank you. Thank you.